Bradley Christmas has worked as a social worker, an English language teacher, and children's entertainer. These days, as a freelance copywriter, he helps charities like Greenpeace, the Royal Flying Doctor Service, and the Sydney Children's Hospital Network share their stories. His short fiction has appeared in a number of magazines and publications, including The Big Issue, and he has received several award nominations. He can also regularly be found performing around Australia with his band Copperline, whose latest single is Gabriel. And Saltwater Boy is his first young adult novel. We're going to talk about that. Hi, Brad.
Hey, Sophie. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. We have spoken about your music, but now I get to talk to you as an author, which is fantastic because you are the only musician I know who's also written a book. That novel is Saltwater Boy. It was out in March this year. I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but the story does sound fantastic. But I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about the story and what the initial spark for it was.
Yeah, sure. It was inspired by, well, it started life as a short story I had published quite a few years ago in the Big Issue, in a fiction edition. They have a short fiction edition. And it was a little short story I wrote about my experiences as a kid. I grew up having holidays, pretty much spending every school holidays at our little extended family holiday home on the south coast of New South Wales in Jervis Bay. And over the course of many, many summers, I formed a really close friendship with local Indigenous fishermen. Mm-hmm. There was an Indigenous community close by, and they very kindly kind of taught me how to fish and really kind of instilled a lifelong passion for fishing in me. It was kind of just about that relationship. As a kid, I was just kind of interested. I hadn't had a lot of contact with Indigenous people. Mm-hmm. And I grew up in an era where, Australian history was Captain Cook and Francis Greenway and Governor Macquarie. So it was kind of like I'd had no education about it and no experience with it. And I just found that kind of world really fascinating. So I wrote the short story, and through a music friend actually met a publisher who liked the sound of the story, and she read it and said, wow, I'd love to turn this into a longer piece of work if you'd thought of that. And I had. So, I kind of worked with her over a few years to just develop it into a novel. Mm-hmm. A novel aimed primarily at kind of young adult readers, but it's been kind of pushed as a crossover kind of between young adult and bigger kids up to the age of 80, as Clay put it, and beyond.
Well, it has a great cover as well, and in publishing that is an important thing. So people can go and look at the cover and also read the book, hopefully. You are an accomplished and experienced songwriter. Copperline songs were recently nominated for awards in the International Songwriting Competition, Tamworth Songwriters Association, I'm tripping over that word, and the Australian Songwriters Association. Writing a novel is quite different, though, to songs, I imagine, or is it?
Yeah, it's absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the obvious thing is it's a much longer game and takes a lot more kind of discipline and, but songs can be a little bit deceptive. They're short, but I mean, it's a bit like poetry. You've got to really distill big, complex ideas into words. So. But I definitely think it takes a bit more discipline and persistence. A lot more kind of frustrations, and there's a lot more you got to think about in terms of keeping a narrative structure and keeping it interesting, and keeping lots of different characters in your head. So I think it just takes a little bit more discipline and work than writing a song. But mm-hmm. It's still. I think the building blocks are the same. The building blocks are language, and you've got to try and create sentences that are beautiful and enjoyable for people to read or listen to. So I guess that, if you kind of think of it, they're the steps. Each sentence or a line is a step. Then it's, a song's a sprint, a book's a marathon.
Except songwriting, I imagine, requires quite a bit of discipline because you don't have much time to get your story across. And so you have to be really attuned to all the nuances of language within that song so that your meaning is very clear. And obviously you have music to help you interpret those lyrics for the listener. and in novels you don't have that. But I'm wondering if that discipline as a songwriter did serve you well when you were writing this novel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, good writing, you need to be really harsh on yourself and, you know, trim the fat, trim everything that doesn't need to be there. And yeah, as you said, songwriting, you've got to do that. There's no space for anything that doesn't need to be there. And you've really got to, you know, what's the minimum detail you need to get an idea across, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a really good skill, I think, to prepare for writing a novel, because you can sort of lose sight of that. I think when you're writing 120, 150,000 words,
Yeah.
you can lose sight of the fact that still every word matters. You know, every word needs a reason for being there, even though there's a lot of them.
Yeah. I'm also curious about your background as an entertainer and whether that's had an influence on you as a novelist, because you're used to seeing your audience right in front of you and giving you feedback. And you've done, as a children's entertainer, Copperline plays in all sorts of venues around Australia and all sorts of environments, festivals, all that sort of thing. So what you've learned about entertaining people, do you think that had, well, sitting in your brain almost when you were writing the novel, you were conscious that there was someone on the other side, there's going to be a reader or readers?
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'd never really thought of it in those terms. I think I'm definitely really conscious of the reader, and perhaps that has come from, you know, constantly, you know, being in front of people and getting that instant reaction. I mean, that's the kind of weird thing about writing a novel that you can probably relate to, is you'll go these really big, long stretches of time without really getting any feedback or response from anybody. And, you know, unless you've got a really strong sense of your own abilities, you can kind of really lose confidence in that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was the tricky part of writing it. But yeah, I was constantly thinking of the kind of people that would be reading the book.
Mhm.
And I get the same with the song, you know, I kind of visualize, all right, what's this going to be like? You know, what are people's reactions, down to the point what their facial expression is going to be like when they hear this line of the song. So yeah, I guess that has sort of helped, you know, visualize the reader, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's an important skill to have. And also, if you do have a strong sense of yourself as a writer, I think you can still go down that rabbit hole where there's a lot of time between interaction and feedback. I don't think it insures you against anything. I'm wondering what or who has inspired you creatively as a novel writer and or as a songwriter now or in the past?
I guess lots of different people. One thing that I've become really passionate about is Australian storytelling. I really gravitate to people who've got a really distinctly Australian voice, and yeah, I've gotten more and more passionate about the importance of Australian stories and seeing ourselves reflected in culture. The cultural cringe is irritating me more and more. You know, there's so much talent here, and there's so much we've got to, like, we don't need to feel insignificant. And I think we can, not in a kind of jingoistic way, but I think we can sort of be confident and be ourselves. So yeah, I've always been inspired by, you know, musically. I mean, I love people like Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly's probably one of my biggest, if not my biggest influences. I just love the way he captured Australian language, captured Australian stories unashamedly, you know. So I love that. And same in literature. I mean, I've got lots of favourite writers, but I'm particularly passionate about Australian writers who capture the landscape. I mean, Tim Winton's the obvious one. I think that I just love the way he captures the beauty and the uniqueness of the Australian coastal landscape. Yeah, writers like that, probably my biggest inspiration.
Yeah, right. And stylistically, do you feel like you've been influenced by Tim Winton, for example, as a writer, or did you try to put aside those sorts of influences from what you'd read and just find your own voice in the novel?
Yeah, I certainly wasn't kind of consciously trying to replicate that style.
Mm,
I think there's this extent to which I couldn't avoid it totally. It's so ingrained in me, that way of writing. But yeah, I just tried to forge a kind of voice and style of my own. But
mm,
yeah, I definitely think it's inspired by a lot of Australian writers. I really love people like Tom Keneally.
mm.
Um, um, Kate Grenville is another really favourite writer of mine. Actually, this book that I'm reading at the moment,
Oh, right. Yeah.
I really love Geraldine Brooks. She's kind of an expat Australian and writes about, um, often writes books set overseas, but in a really Australian way, I reckon.
Mhm, yeah, right. That's a very interesting way to put it. I hadn't thought of it like that, but yes, she does. Now, unlike a lot of book writers where we might have one idea and then that turns into a book and it takes however long, as a songwriter, you have multiple ideas that you're then turning into songs. So I'm interested in whether you had the same process when you started the novel as starting a song where you have an idea and then start to turn it into something, or was it a completely different process for you in terms of just going from that spark and then constructing the story?
They're probably fairly similar. I think similar things for me kind of spark stories and songs. It usually starts with a character, and that character might be a version of myself, or someone totally removed um, from me, but who's just experienced something that I'm interested in exploring and interrogating a little bit. So yeah, I mean, definitely the book started with a character and an interaction, and definitely the character had elements of me in my experience, but wasn't totally me.
Mm,
And it just kind of grew out of that one experience, that interaction I had with that one group of people, and I just kind of followed where that took. Once I got to know the characters, where that took the
mm,
story. Um, and a lot of my songs are like that. It'll be a person that I find particularly interesting, or an experience that someone's had that I find kind of interesting that I want to explore. So yeah, I think for me, they start in really similar places.
mhm. Now, I imagine you do have a different writing process because obviously, when you have a song, you can pick up a guitar, you can start to work it out that way. But with a novel, there's none of that. There's no going into the studio to experiment with things. So, what was your writing process for the novel? Were you making yourself sit down and write a certain amount each time, or were you just trying to fit it in when you could, or something else?
Yeah, when I got serious about writing the novel, I realised if you wait for an appropriate time for it to happen, it won't. So I just kind of got really disciplined at the first hour or a couple of hours every day. I just kind of set aside. And that was the kind of time of day when I felt easy to get in the flow of it. Is that kind of first hour or two of the day when your mind's a bit clearer, and
Mhm.
so yeah, I just kind of got in the habit of doing it every day, and sort of set myself a bit of a target of writing 1,000 words every day, to feel like I was making progress. And yeah, and I think that because it's a really tricky thing, and it's easy to feel like you're losing momentum with it, but it's if you just kind of keep up that discipline,
Mhm.
uh, you feel like you're making progress. But I've started to apply that a little bit with songwriting, because it can kind of be the same with
Mhm.
songwriting if you sort of just waiting for inspiration and time. Often those things never line up. So I think just carving out a little bit of time every day to chip away at a song, or and you might only come up with one line that you've been trying to fix for 6 months, but sort of still feels like you're making progress if you're working at it every day.
And actually, what you just said about one line that you've been trying to fix for 6 months makes me wonder, when you were writing the novel, were you tempted to just stay on a sentence for a while because that's what you may do in a song?
That was a pitfall I had to overcome really quickly because I think, I mean, especially in an early draft of a story, I think if you can kind of lose the thread if you get too bogged down in the detail of one sentence, you know, and I have a real tendency to do that. I could happily sit there for an hour and move a comma around to make a sentence perfect, and you know, but yeah, you don't make much progress if you do that. And I think that's kind of the role for me for later drafts, is when you go through and work out the language. I kind of worked out you needed to kind of keep, once you were inside the characters' heads and you kind of had a clear idea of what was happening, you needed to keep up some momentum of the story and let the story unfold, and not obsess over language and stuff that first draft, and come back to that, you know, on a second draft, and you know, then I can overanalyze every sentence on the second draft.
And again, I wonder if your background as a musician helped you come to that understanding pretty early, because it's your first book, and some people will learn that about drafting in later books. But as a recorded songwriter, as a recorded musician, you're used to taking a song, going into a studio, the producer has some input, different versions will emerge, and then you'll take it to a live performance, and it may shift and change again, and the song could end up being quite different. So you're used to, I guess, an evolution of a story and through a song, and knowing that different people have input and it's not going to be the same as the way it started. So I think it seems like almost instinctually you came to that realization that, you know, even though you said you did have to sort of remind yourself that the first draft didn't have to be perfect, that background of yours helped you come to that possibly a lot more smoothly than it might have otherwise done.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was the hardest thing about writing the book, having come from music, is in music you've constantly got, you know, walls to bounce your ideas off. You know, the band, you know, when you bring the song to the band, you're getting feedback, and it's kind of this collaborative process that I really enjoy, of watching the creative idea that you had blossom with other people's input. And you don't really get any of that writing a book, you know, apart from, you know, every few months checking in with your editor or your publisher. You're kind of just hammering away in the dark. I mean, I've been involved in some writers groups and stuff, which I think was really helpful. It was just to, you know, more for your kind of mental health than the writing process probably. But yeah, that was the biggest challenge, is just, you know, working in isolation and just wondering, oh, is this any good? You know?
Yeah, it can be a challenge. Now, I'm wondering if you have a tip for anyone who's thinking about starting writing a young adult novel or anything, even a song, something that you think may help them to get started.
I think I mean, it sounds really obvious, but just get in the habit of doing it, and doing it all the time. It's amazing how many people kind of you talk to say they want to do, so they want to write a novel or they want to write an album or something, and you kind of ask them, well, you know, how much writing are you doing? Oh, I'm not. I'm just waiting for the right idea. Like, I think that there's that kind of romantic idea that some great idea is going to fall out of the sky, and you know, then your brilliant, you know, first novel will come out of you fully formed. And maybe it happens for some people, but that certainly doesn't happen, or hasn't happened for me. So you know, it's a bit of a struggle, and you've just got to push through it, and just don't be too hard on yourself. I mean, it was great reading some, you know, really famous writers who will openly say, "Oh, my first draft's always rubbish," you know, but you know, that's the rubbish you got to pour out on the table to kind of pick through to find the gold. So yeah, I think just getting in the habit of doing it, and not being too hard on yourself, but being disciplined, and but not, you know, too self-censoring and, you know, self-critical.
Mm-hmm. And has there ever been some great writing advice that you've been given?
I've just picked up kind of from reading a few different books. I mean, I picked up that kind of, I heard an interview with John Grisham talking about how he wrote his first novel, and he's just like, he was, you know, busy, had a full-time job as a lawyer, a couple of kids, massively busy. And he said, I just turned up in my office an hour before work, just sat and worked at a computer every day. and that, you know, and he said, there's no substitute for that. Stephen King's book on writing, I reckon, is one of the best kind of just how-to self-help advice books on writing, and he kind of says the same thing. It's just sit down and do it, you know. And you can sort of, I think there's, you know, you can do so many writing courses, there's so many books you can read and things you can listen to, but there's no substitute for just sitting down and doing it, you know.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree. Now, you've already given us some great book recommendations, and you've also mentioned some music, but I am going to ask you, because you are a musician who's written a book, is there a favorite? Do you have a favorite book that you'd like to recommend? And it's possibly very cruel to ask you if you have a favorite musician or a favorite album to mention, but if you have anything you'd like to recommend, please share it with us.
Well, favorite artist is probably easier. It comes to mind quickly. I'm a massive fan of Jason Isbell. He's a friend of mine because I saw him just a couple of weeks ago. He was out here for Blues Fest. I saw him at a sideshow in Sydney. Just the most extraordinary songwriter who can make you laugh your head off and burst into tears in the space of a couple of songs. So yeah, I think over the last kind of 10 years, he's been probably my favorite songwriter.
Mm-hmm.
Favorite book. Yeah, I really, as I said, I really love writing about Australia. Yeah, I mean, Cloud Street is a book that I come back to time and again. I just love the writing in that, love the writing about place, love the way it kind of captures and celebrates the quirkiness and beauty of the Australian kind of vernacular. Yeah, that's probably the book that jumps into mind at first. I mean, that's one that everyone knows and loves.
Yeah, but not everyone has read, so they may now go and read it. Well, Bradley Christmas, your novel is called Saltwater Boy, and it is out now. It's available on all retailers. I have checked, it's everywhere. And Copperline's album is Borrowed, Broken and Blue, and that is available on streaming services and possibly CDs. I know CDs are still available for some people, but yes.
Yeah, and vinyl also. So if people, they're available on Bandcamp. And also on our website. So if you want a vinyl record, or a CD, we'll send them out to you. We've got them available in both formats.
Fantastic. Well, you have had great creative output over the past year. I can't wait to see what you come up with next. In the meantime, thanks for talking to me.
My absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on.